Back to the Leadership Lab. Today, I am going to be exploring some of the reasons why young leaders get stuck when trying to grow and develop themselves. And more importantly, I'm going to be unpacking some of the research and science backed solutions, as well as solutions that are supported by my own experiences that I learned while serving in the SEAL teams so that you as a young leader can build habits and strategies that actually make you a better leader in the real world rather than just relying on feel good ideas that you read in the latest leadership book. And with as with all my videos, these 5 challenges that I'm going to be covering today come from the confluence of my own experiences and my own observations leading and being led in teams in high stakes environments, as well as decades of the latest academic research on leadership. And so, if you're a young leader who cares about becoming someone who can build teams that perform under pressure, make decisions that you can stand behind, and avoid traps that are going to keep you from developing as a leader in your career, then this is the video. So, let's get into it. Now, the first challenge that we're going to go over that young leaders are faced with while developing their leadership is something that we can refer to as the knowing doing gap. And it helps explain why training, particularly leadership training, doesn't necessarily equal development and transformation. And from a research perspective, this is based on a few key ideas. First is the skills based approach to leadership, which holds that effective leadership is rooted in learnable, developable skills rather than just inborn traits or fixed personalities. It's also based on the behavioral leadership approach, which is similar but focuses on what leaders actually do while leading, so their behaviors and actions. And third is based on an article by Mumford titled The Nine Critical Skills, which is a set of common cognitive skills that all effective leaders seem to have in display. And then lastly, this challenge is also based on an article by Hopp and Pruschak titled Is There Such Thing as Leadership Skill? Which asks if leadership is a skill that can be tracked across long-term timeframes starting when someone is young. And so the knowing doing gap is perhaps the biggest, oldest, and possibly even the most frustrating challenge a young leader is going to face when trying to develop themselves. And a trend that I notice when discussing leadership is that everyone seems to know what good leadership looks like, but very, very few people can actually do it consistently when it matters. And even someone like me, who has been deliberately studying and practicing leadership for most of my life, when I was at the Naval Academy, when I was in the SEAL teams, I continue to get it wrong, at least sometimes, because it's really hard. And so developing your leadership, can involve workshops and seminars that cost thousands of dollars, certification, countless hours spent on whatever the latest leadership book is. But when the stress hits and the stakes are high and the complexity and complications of influencing real people who have their own ideas, their own opinions, their own biases, and arrive at their own conclusions arrives, and when a team is struggling or someone is underperforming on your team, most people are going to default to their old habits. And this doesn't necessarily happen solely due to a lack of knowledge or intelligence. It's also, and perhaps even predominantly so, a lack of practice, reflection, and reintegration. And so the research shows us a few key ideas to help young leaders get around this knowing doing gap. First is the skills based approach, which was developed by a person named Robert Katz. And the approach says that leadership is more like a craft or a sport than a list of stable traits. So Katz classifies leadership skill into three key areas. The first of which is technical skill, which are your domain and industry specific skills. The second are your human skills, which is your ability to work with other people. And third are your conceptual skills, which is your ability to work with ideas. So, in other words, you can know how to deadlift or you can know how to throw a punch, but if you never actually do it under load, with pressure, and with feedback, you're never going to get strong. You're never going to learn how to throw a punch. And so, the key here, like so many other things, is understanding that there is a difference between knowing something in your head and actually living it. Another critical piece to overcoming this challenge is going to be based off of Mumford's 2017 article of critical leadership skills, where he identified and studied 9 critical skills when it comes to effective leadership. So, skills like creative thinking, social judgment, problem solving. He found that only those who practiced these 9 skills in real life settings with feedback, with reflection, with reintegration showed sustained improvement. The third strategy to overcoming the knowing doing gap is inspired by Hopp and Pruschak's 2020 article from the Leadership Quarterly, which tracked people from high school through later life. And they found that early leadership roles, particularly the combination of early leadership roles like team captain or a club president in high school, didn't necessarily lead to higher earnings or leadership positions later unless those same people kept practicing and kept refining their skills through their life and through their experiences that they accumulated. And then the fourth strategy to overcoming this knowing doing gap is going to be based on Ohio State and University of Michigan's research, particularly the work of individuals by the names of Ralph Stogdill and Rensis Likard, who identified what's been deemed the behavioral leadership approach. And they did this back in the 1940s and 50s. And their research makes a crucial point related to this challenge. And that is leadership isn't just what you know, it's what you do. And it's especially what you do under pressure. So, what are the actual tactical, practical solutions to this challenge? Well, the solutions to this knowing doing gap are going to come in several forms. The first is incorporating some form of deliberate practice of your leadership and influence skills and approaching this practice with consistent and candid feedback loops. So, Mumford recommends deliberate practice, which means repeatedly working on your specific leadership behaviors, like having tough conversations, learning who and how to delegate to, coaching, decision making, getting feedback on your actual performance rather than your perceptions and intentions. And I would also add that you want feedback from the whole scope of people that you interact with on a consistent basis, which is going to include followers, peers, and also those who you lead. The feedback that you get should be timely and specific. A generic good job or be more confident isn't going to be enough and it's not going to be helpful to you. So if you get something like that, ask harder questions of the people that are giving you feedback. You need to have actionable behavioral feedback that you can walk away with. Something like, here's where you interrupted too quickly. So let's work on that. And this also goes for the feedback that you give to others as well. Since every leader should be playing a part in developing the leaders underneath them, make sure that you're also giving specific and timely feedback to your followers. The second solution to this knowing doing gap is some form of on the job training, on the job coaching, and stretch assignments. So Hopp and Pruschak found that the learning by doing approach is far more effective than any training program that you do on its own. So leaders should and perhaps must be given some form of stretch assignment, which are going to be projects and roles that force you out of your comfort zone with coaching support to back it up and the psychological scaffolding needed to feel like you can fail and then learn from those mistakes without some sort of punishment or negative consequences. And if you aren't being given stretch assignments, go and seek them out yourself. Even if you aren't able to actively participate or contribute to different assignments, just asking if you can observe others working on them and be in the same room while these conversations are happening, you're going to benefit from it. So, an example is going to be something like rotating new or young managers or leaders through challenging projects early in their career or assigning them to a team in some form of crisis, along with an experienced leader or mentor who you are shadowing and then getting debriefed from afterwards. So you can practice, fail, reflect, and then integrate the lessons that you've learned. The next tactical solution to this knowing doing gap is incorporating new behavioral triggers and making deliberate reflection points in your development. And so this is based on the behavioral approach, which suggests setting up daily triggers or micro routines that remind you to practice your new skills. So, an example of this is going to be after every meeting that you go to, jot down one thing you did well as a leader, or even jotting down something that someone else did well as a leader and something that you'd like to improve on or integrate yourself. And then the last tactical solution is incorporating dedicated reflection periods and after action reviews into your leadership journey. So it would be prudent to create a habit of debriefing, even if it's just by yourself, and take the time to ask yourself what worked, what didn't, what can I do differently next time. This sort of debrief strategy is a staple in all elite teams across the world, from the military to professional sports. And this isn't something that you're always going to have the time to do during the course of a normal working day. So you should get used to doing it on your off time if you want to increase the speed of your development as a leader. So, to review, tactical takeaways for navigating the problem of this knowing doing gap when it comes to young leader development. Don't just attend leadership seminars and workshops. Don't just read books. Definitely do those things, do them both, but also doing things like scheduling simulated leadership practice sessions is going to pay huge dividends. Whether that is leader skills that are industry specific and domain specific skills, or that is leadership influence skills, both are worthwhile. Second is using structured, peer-based feedback circles where you're accountable to actually learn what you use. And then third is keeping some form of leadership journal, tracking what you learned, what you did, and what the outcome was, positive or negative. Whenever I was working in the SEAL teams, I always had at least two notebooks, usually more, but I had at least one for all my daily tasks. And then I had another for all my leadership reflection notes. Okay. The second major challenge with developing young leaders and the challenges young leaders face has to do with context, and more specifically, context blindness, because there is a danger and risk when it comes to generic leadership advice that is floating around out there. And so this is going to be based on four key research topics. The first is situational leadership theory by Hershey and Blanchard, which suggests that leaders need to be able to adapt their leadership style to a couple key dimensions when it comes to their followers. It's also based on Northhouse Path-Goal Theory of leadership. It's based on the behavioral leadership approach, which we just covered. And then it's also based on leadership emergence models, which pulls from a lot of evolutionary psychology theory. So when it comes to contextual blindness and leadership advice, there's often a mistaken belief that there's a one size fits all model for leadership. And this is where a lot of leadership models get romanticized and sometimes even worshiped as the only approach you need as a leader. And it's been my observation, and the research supports me on this, that people and therefore leadership is too complex and too complicated of a phenomenon to rely solely on one approach. It makes you inflexible, it makes you ideological by definition, it makes you less pragmatic, so less likely to consider both context and people, and it makes you less responsive to the real challenges of leadership, which is influencing people. And the internet is full of flashy tips and slogans like always listen, take charge, empower your people, connect more. And the reality is that what worked for me in a SEAL platoon doesn't always work for a hospital team or a construction crew or a startup. And while the principles may remain the same, the context and the application of those principles is going to change based on what's in front of you. So anyone that says something like servant leadership or transformational leadership is the only way to lead doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, because leadership is too complicated to rely on one single approach. And so the research shows us a few things that are worth talking about. First has to do with the situational leadership theory and path goal theory, which both explicitly show us that effective leadership depends on matching your style to the team's needs, the task, the stakes in front of you, and even the culture of the organization that you're a part of. Both theories also show that there is no universally best way to lead. So, what seems to matter more is whether you can diagnose the situation in front of you and then adapt your leadership to that problem. The leadership emergence research shows us that there are common traits and behaviors that help people emerge as leaders faster. However, it also shows that different contexts can promote different kinds of leaders faster than others. And so, in a crisis, boldness might get rewarded with leadership, but in a complex technical environment, the quiet analytical thinker may in fact matter more. And so, behavioral leadership research confirms that the right behaviors change with the context. So, what are the solutions to the context blindness challenge when it comes to developing young leaders? Well, the best solutions are going to come in several forms. The first solution that I would encourage is to leverage adaptive leadership models. The situational leadership approach was profoundly useful to me whenever I was in the SEAL teams. Again, it contends that leaders assess the readiness and commitment of their team and adjust how much direction or support or coaching they give. So, in a new or struggling team, or with a new or struggling individual on your team, a directive style is going to be more helpful. For someone that is more skilled, a team that is more skilled, more mature, a hands off, supportive leadership approach might be what works best. And then, secondly, the path goal theory suggests that leaders should spend attention and effort on clarifying the path to success, working to preemptively and proactively remove the obstacles in front of their team, and then along the way, adapt their approach depending on the task and the team variables that they're navigating. The second solution to the context blindness challenge is incorporating some sort of contextual analysis training with your team. And this is based on research that strongly supports training and mentoring leaders in context reading, which means looking at all the variables, people, goals, urgency, organizational culture before you pick an approach. Now, this also comes with experience and reflection. So, if you're lacking in this area, find yourself a good mentor that can help with this. In addition to that, scenario based training is also a powerful tool for both domain specific skills that you need as a leader and influence skills that you need as a leader. So, giving leaders multiple simulated vignettes and forcing them to pick different decisions, different leadership styles, and then debrief why they made the decisions is going to be really helpful. The third solution to this context blindness challenge is going to involve acquiring some form of rotational experience and contextual intelligence. And what I mean by that is leaders who have operated in more diverse roles in a bigger variety of settings tend to develop stronger context sensitivity. And this is backed by the leadership emergence research that shows that those who have been exposed to both high pressure scenarios and routine environments are going to be better at adapting their leadership to the problem at hand. So rotating assignments and cross training is what's gonna be what builds this muscle and this skill. And if you can't rotate assignments because you're stuck in your role and you don't have time or you don't have permission, finding the time to at least observe others in tangentially related assignments or departments within your organization so that you can build context about how your organization or industry works is going to be really helpful here. And then the fourth solution to this context blindness challenge that young leaders face is seeking feedback from multiple contexts. And what I mean by that is leaders should be seeking feedback not from just their own team that they lead, but from their peers in related departments and stakeholders in other settings. So, and that's because what works with one group may not necessarily be what works with another. So, learning as much as you can about what works across multiple groups is going to build your context intelligence when it comes to your leadership skills. So, to recap, context blindness, take a step back, ask yourself before you act, what does this situation really need from me? Build a repeatable and easily recalled checklist, things that include team maturity, task urgency, cultural norms. 5 to 7 things on a checklist is plenty. It should be something that you can remember without having the piece of paper in front of you. And then, as much as you can remember, use this checklist before defaulting to your usual leadership style until it becomes more refined. Also, if you're someone that is developing or training young leaders, scenario based drills are going to be a really, really beneficial thing for you to incorporate. As much as you're able to, put them in unfamiliar contexts and force them to flex their leadership style against simulated real problems. And then consider cross training or exchange programs, even if it's informal, so that young leaders are exposed to as many new environments as you're able to get them exposed to. The third challenge to developing young leaders is something that we can call the hero trap. And this involves overvaluing individual traits over teams and systems. And this challenge is based on research from the leadership emergence models, the leader member exchange theory, which focuses on the unique individualized relationships that leaders develop with each team member. It's focused on followership theory, which recognizes that followers are an active and influential participant in the leadership process. And then it's also based on team leadership models. So this third challenge of the hero trap has to do a lot with our cultural obsession with the one great leader who single-handedly can make everything happen on their own. We see it in business, we see it in politics, and we especially see it in the media. And unfortunately, for those who buy into this, the reality of leadership is much messier and much harder. And my own experience, my own observations, and the research backs this up. So, what the research really shows, particularly with the leadership emergence research by authors like Paunonen and Rovelli and Curnis, is that those who quickly rise into visible leadership positions often do so because they have strong personalities and sometimes are even narcissistic in their personality tendencies, which the research is absolutely clear that narcissistic personalities rise to leadership faster than others. But this rise to leadership based on personality doesn't always correlate to leadership effectiveness once those people are in those positions. So many emergent leaders who are great at getting noticed based on charisma, bold action, strong personalities aren't always as effective at delivering results and building healthy teams in the long run. Now, the leader member exchange theory, which again focuses on the unique and individual relationships that a leader has with each team member, shifts that focus. So, as someone emerges as a leader or is selected as a leader, effective leadership becomes more about the quality of relationships that you build with the people on your team. And so, teams that perform better do so because there is a reasonable degree of trust, there's transparent, candid, but still respectful communication. And then there's also some sense of partnership and shared ownership amongst the team rather than one single person who is dictating orders from the top. Now, the followership and team leadership models show that some degree of distributed leadership and influence where team members are empowered with both the skills and permission and also accountability might be harder to establish in the short term, but if done successfully, tend to produce better leadership outcomes and performance outcomes over time. So, based on all this research, what are the best solutions to this challenge that young leaders face with the hero trap? Well, the first solution is to develop more team based leadership. The leader member exchange theory recommends that leaders invest as much time as they're able into each relationship with each individual on their team. This means listening, coaching, supporting people individually rather than just addressing the group by broadcasting directive orders. It also shows that stronger relationships tend to drive higher engagement, higher team loyalty, and more discretionary effort on behalf of the team. It's also important to promote some degree of shared and distributed leadership within your team. Now, the degree of shared leadership and distributed leadership is going to change based on the context, your team makeup, and even specific tasks, but it's still important. And the research shows that high performing teams have some form of shared leadership functions. Now, the leader might set the vision, but team members are, or at least should, inevitably take turns influencing decisions, leading certain phases of projects, solving specific problems, and even representing the group to external groups. This is supported by the team leadership models, the followership research, as well as my own experience with teams. If you're able to facilitate some form of shared leadership, shared influence, distributed leadership, distributed influence, teams are going to be more agile, more adaptable, and more resilient when everyone feels that they have a voice. The next solution to this challenge of the hero trap that young leaders face is going to be for all you haters of transactional leadership styles out there. And this involves incorporating some form of systemic recognition and reward structures. Now, instead of rewarding only individual heroics, it's better to create a system that also recognizes the collaborative wins that the team has, process improvements that the team is able to make, and group contributions. The research on narcissistic tendencies as it relates to leadership shows that the star behavior that you see from trait narcissism is much less likely to become toxic if a team is able to create systems that provide constraints to that behavior, systems that facilitate humility, that facilitate accountability and then enforce it on the back end. The next solution to this challenge of the hero trap that's based on the research is going to involve debriefing your wins, debriefing your losses, and then celebrating team learning just as much, if not more, than celebrating individual success on the team. So, the strategy of using regular team debriefs, not just to spotlight success, but to analyze mistakes and learn together as a team is critical. This creates the necessary psychological scaffolding and improves the collective capability of the team when it comes to leadership challenges. So, tactical takeaways for young leaders when it comes to this hero trap. Rotate leadership and project ownership within the team as much as feasible so that everyone develops their influence muscles. During your team reviews, make sure that you include questions that explore team functionality, something like how did the team work together and what did we achieve as a group, good or bad. It's also really useful to create small rituals that celebrate team milestones in a way that doesn't make it mandatory fun and it doesn't just celebrate individual performance. And then lastly, encourage followership principles amongst your team, which includes yourself as a leader, making it clear that questioning, suggesting, and influencing decisions is valued from anybody on the team, as long as it's done in a respectable nature. The fourth major challenge to developing young leaders is what I'm going to call the measurement mirage. And it has to do with why good leadership is so hard to prove. Now, on the research side, this is backed by a few things. One is the common method bias. Second is the skills based approach to leadership. Third is the Hopp and Pruschak article that I keep referencing regarding leadership skill. And then fourth has to do with humility, narcissism, firm innovation when it comes to CEOs. So, the fourth challenge to developing young leaders, measuring good leadership. Scientists want to measure leadership. Us normal folk want to be able to effectively judge it. And a lot of us think we can. But what actually gets measured, does it actually tell us anything real? And what are we actually judging when we say this is good leadership? And moreover, is our idea of leadership precise enough to do with any sort of intellectual responsibility? Way too often, organizations rely on subjective feedback, something like my boss is inspiring on certain questionnaires, annual ratings, leadership potential lists, and then individuals tend to rely on their own subjective experiences and definition of leadership, both of which are riddled with bias. So, what the research actually shows when it comes to measuring leadership is similar to the problems that many social scientists face, where leadership is not immune to what's known as the common method bias, which is essentially when the same person rates both their own leadership and the results, or when the evaluation tool that's being used is unclear about what good leadership looks like. Now, The proponents of the skill-based leadership approach says that leadership should be measured through observable, specific behaviors, things like how someone gives feedback, solves problems, makes decisions, rather than subjective and vague impressions. And articles like Zhang's 2017 article, which studied CEO humility and narcissism, found that while you can empirically measure traits, such as those that support leadership, empirically linking them to the outcomes is really, really tricky. Outcomes like performance in a leadership position, when it comes to team innovation, firm performance, variables like that, is affected by a lot of different variables, not just leadership alone. So, measuring leadership's impact on those different dimensions requires clear, multi source, and behavioral based data that is really hard to formulate questions for, and really hard to collect, and really hard to make connections to, that are causal connections rather than just correlations. So, what does the research say about the best solutions for this challenge of measuring leadership? Well, the most reliable solution to this challenge comes from is going to come from multi-source feedback tools like 360 evaluations, and that involves gathering input from subordinates, peers, supervisors, and even external partners if it makes sense. And these anonymous feedback surveys are a contemporary leadership evaluation tool, and it's still one of the best ways to see how leadership is actually experienced at different levels. These leadership tools, like the 360 evaluation tool, tends to be something that effectively reduces rater bias and provides a more holistic view on someone's leadership. Now, one thought on these multi source feedback tools from my own experience. These feedback tools can be really frustrating for leaders because sometimes you're going to get feedback that isn't always helpful, or at least doesn't seem to be true. Now, what I would recommend is that even if the feedback that you get isn't helpful or it doesn't seem to be true, I would view that negative feedback as an indicator that something about your leadership is being perceived as ineffective or negative, even if that specific feedback item seems to be objectively false. And what I mean by that is, assume the people that you're leading are smart enough to find legitimate fault in your leadership, even if they lack the precision in language in their ability to articulate it. So assume that there's something worth uncovering in the negative feedback items that you've received, and go and seek it out with your team. And what you'll find oftentimes is that the negative issue that you received was a symptom of something deeper going on, or something that you were doing that was indicative of a deeper root cause. But the effort to go and explore and discover and uncover that issue is what is going to be the thing that allows you to discover what the real problem is and then adjust accordingly. Now, the second solution to this challenge of measuring good leadership comes from behavioral and outcome based metrics. That is going to include certain things from the skills based approach to leadership, which again advocates tracking actual leadership behaviors, such as the number of feedback sessions that you hold, the conflicts you've resolved, the innovations that you've supported. And it's going to involve looking for links between your leadership behaviors to your desired team outcomes, like engagement, retention, productivity, safety, mishaps, and team innovation. The next solution to this challenge of measuring good leadership is incorporating more clear and more transparent measurement criteria. So, if you're trying to assess your young leaders or your young leader that's trying to assess yourself, creating and using a rubric of some sort that defines standards for what good leadership looks like in your organizational context is going to be really useful. Hopp and Pruschak actually suggests that longitudinal tracking, so following a leader's growth and impact over a long time frame, such as years, is going to beat snapshot reviews every time. So the snapshot reviews are important, but doing so episodically and consistently over longer time frames is actually what's going to give you your trend in terms of how you're developing as a leader. And then the last solution that the leadership literature suggests when it comes to measuring good leadership involves separating measurements of results and perceptions. So Zhang's article from 2017 notes that it's important to distinguish between how people feel about a leader and what the data actually says about their performance results. So, using both quantitative metrics and KPIs, along with qualitative information like stories and feedback measures from the 360 evaluation tools, is what's going to create a better picture of how you're performing and developing as a leader. So, tactical takeaways for measuring good leadership: don't rely on one source of truth, use multiple data points. Second, develop clear and observable leadership competencies for yourself, your organization, and your team. Regularly review the metrics that you tie directly to leadership actions, not just the end results that you see after the fact. And then use leadership journaling and reflection logs to capture and track your progress as a developing leader over time. The fifth and last challenge that young leaders face when developing their leadership involves ignoring what we can call the dark side of leadership. And by that, I mean failing to address the negative traits when it comes to leadership. And this is based on research from narcissism and emergent leadership models. It's based on the relationship between CEO humility and narcissism. And it's based on the research into the dark side of transformational leadership. So, the fifth challenge for young leaders when developing themselves is ignoring the darker sides of leadership. Now, almost all of the leadership books and all the leadership training that I've seen out there tend to focus on the positive aspects and the positive models of leadership: vision, authenticity, courage, charisma, transformation, servant leadership. All those things are great. But modern research says ignoring the shadow side of leadership, the narcissism, the manipulation, the abuse of power, which all help catapult people in positions of leadership in the first place, sets you up for failure as a leader, particularly a young leader, because you have less wisdom and discernment in recognizing it. So the research, particularly from Paunonen in his 2006 article, shows that narcissistic traits are in fact strongly associated with leadership emergence. There's no getting around that, particularly in high visibility and competitive settings. Narcissistic traits tend to tend to ascend the leadership hierarchy faster, and they tend to hold more influence earlier on in team settings. However, these same traits that propel someone into a position of leadership or influence faster often predict future problems, higher turnover, more toxic culture, and even unethical behavior. Now, Rovelli and Curnis's 2021 article shows that the perks of narcissism are real. And what I mean by that is behaving like you're a superstar accelerates your promotion to the top of the organization. But along the way, it's going to erode trust, it's going to stifle dissent, and it creates a climate of fear and it creates a climate of instability along the way. And additionally, Zhang's 2017 article found a really interesting paradox. And it's one of the many reasons why I'm such a strong advocate for at least learning about the utility of dark triad traits when it comes to leadership. You know, some narcissism can fuel necessary risk taking and innovation. However, without the systems that enforce humility and systems of accountability, it tends to lead to ethical lapses in judgment, and it tends to lead to organizational decline over the long term. So, what does the research say are the best solutions to navigating the darker sides of leadership? Well, first is integrating an awareness of this darker side of leadership in your own the leadership development. Paunonen and Zhang's article both recommend making the dark side of leadership a core topic when it comes to leadership development programs. Studying cases of both great and failed leaders is going to be really useful here. So, analyzing where unchecked egos and lack of ethics caused issues, caused crises, caused disasters, and then encourage an open dialogue about the influence of power and motives and the temptation to misuse authority in leadership positions. The second solution, based on research, when it comes to navigating the dark side of leadership, is promoting self awareness and humility. 360 feedback tools are really useful here because they identify these sorts of things. And it's hard to ignore the opinions of 25 people who all think you're a narcissist. Executive coaching, who where people that are more experienced than you, higher up in the organization than you, are giving you candid feedback about negative personality traits that you have are really useful. And then even peer assessments from people that are your peers that you work with or people that you work around are going to help you confront these blind spots that you might have. Second, when it comes to promoting self awareness and humility, is based on Zhang's article, and that involves training in organizational cultures that encourage humility and reflective practices are going to help counterbalance these darker sides of leadership like narcissistic tendencies. This is something that the SEAL teams do really, really well. Now, we may seem narcissistic, cavalier, and self aggrandizing to outsiders because we're dominant, because we're confident. But within the organization and amongst other SEALs, those traits and behaviors of narcissism and grandiose confidence are traits and behaviors that are heavily scorned within the community. So people that display those on a consistent basis tend not to do really well in terms of their leadership and influence. The last issue on the idea of promoting self awareness and humility is going to include exercises where leaders are asked to admit mistakes and invite critique of themselves from their team. And this is another instance where debriefs are really helpful when it comes to leadership development. The third solution that's backed by research when it comes to navigating the dark side of leadership has to do with building a system of checks and balances. Now, Rovelli and Curnis's 2021 article suggests that organizational systems like ethic committees, decision audits, whistleblower protections are all institutional systems that are useful in limiting the damage of unchecked power. This makes it easier and it makes it less risky for people to speak up and be candid about toxic or unethical leadership behaviors that they're observing. The fourth and last solution when it comes to navigating the darker side of leadership involves explicitly defining and rewarding what your organization considers as integrity based behavior, including integrity, humility, and ethical leadership as criteria for promotion rather than just results or charisma is what's going to help with this. And I would also encourage teams to not only celebrate their high performers, but lift up the members on the team who are upholding the behaviors and values that you want to see in your team and in your organization. Tactical takeaways for navigating the dark side of leadership include case studies of failure in all your leadership training programs. Use anonymous surveys and exit interviews to surface toxic behaviors earlier. Regularly discuss values, ethics, and integrity at all levels of the team and at all levels of the organization. And consistently ask, how are we protecting our organization or our team from the risks of unchecked power and unchecked ego? Let's recap what we learned about the top challenges that young leaders face when it comes to developing their leaders. When it comes to developing their leadership, first is the knowing doing gap. That involves understanding that knowledge alone doesn't change behavior. Deliberate real world practice with honest feedback is essential for young leaders to grow themselves. Second is context blindness, which involves understanding that there is no universal leadership recipe. The best leaders, the most effective leaders, are the ones who can diagnose each situation and adapt their leadership accordingly. The third is a hero trap, and that involves understanding that effective leadership isn't about lone heroes. It's about building teams, building systems, investing in relationships, and sharing your influence with the people on your team. The fourth challenge to developing young leaders involves measuring what good leadership actually looks like. And so, to grow yourself as a leader, to develop young leaders, you have to measure the right things: behaviors, outcomes, and the experiences and perceptions of those that you're leading. So, using multiple perspectives, multiple tools, and clear standards to measure that is important. And then the last challenge that young leaders face is ignoring the darker side of leadership. And that has to do with the fact that leadership requires confronting both strengths and risks. So, studying your failures, studying other people's failures, promoting humility, displaying humility, and putting guardrails in place for your young leaders or for yourself as a young leader is what's going to help with that. If you want to build lasting leadership as a young leader or for young leaders, for your whole team, for your organization, I would encourage you to start with these 5 fundamentals. Practice them relentlessly. Seek to understand context. Seek to build your team. Seek to build solid systems. Measure what actually matters to you, and then never shy away from seeking the truth, even if it's uncomfortable for you. Now, if this episode helped see something about your own leadership journey in a new light, like and subscribe to the channel. I will always bring research-backed leadership content, and share your toughest leadership challenge in the comments if you want me to go over it.